Okay, this is let's see, our first day graphing these. So let's see how this goes. So here's your general form of your equation, right? The number in front of your trig is the amplitude. Right? How tall, right? Tall is this funny word. It's how high or low above the midline, right? The middle of your function. That's your amplitude. Okay, the b helps us to calculate the period. Okay, period is always 2 pi over b. How long does it take for this graph to complete one cycle? C is your phase shift. This is what moves our graph to the left or to the right. And D is your vertical shift. It's what moves your graph points up or down. Okay, so we're going to identify these things first from our equation, and then we're going to do a sketch. So number one, for cosine of x. The number in front of the trig is our amplitude. So our amplitude for this graph is going to be 4. The period. Notice that there's no number in front of x, which means it's 1, right? If there's nothing in front of x, then it can be assumed a 1. So this period is going to be 2 pi. Okay, no phase shift because there's no parentheses, no vertical shift. There's nothing after the cosine. Okay, so we have an amplitude of 4 and your standard period. So how does a cosine graph go? Well, cosine always starts at a max. So we're going to start 4 units above the x-axis, right? The x-axis is your midline without a vertical shift. The x-axis is the middle. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4 units above that midline, and that's our first point. Okay, so now we have a little bit of autonomy. You have some choice as far as where do you want your 2 pi to go. Okay, so you can make it, if you want to, you can make 2 pi be this line. If you want to, you can make 2 pi be that line. If you want to, I wouldn't say make it the third line. You could make this your 2 pi. Okay, I might suggest, though, that you put it in the middle. So this is going to be our 2 pi line, right? We're going to label our x-axis basically however you want, but make it make sense with your graph. So let's call this the 2 pi line. So what we know about cosine is it starts at a max. So here we have your max at the origin, and it also ends at a max. That is one complete period from max to min to max. So this is what we know about cosine. It starts at a max and it ends at a max if it's positive. Okay. In the middle of your 2 maxes is going to be your minimum. And notice that it's 4 units below your midline, right? Your midline is the x-axis. So this is where we count your amplitude from. 4 units above the midline and 4 units below the midline. Okay. What's in the middle of a max and a min is going to be another 0. So it's going to have a 0 here and a 0 there. Okay, and we can talk about what those coordinates are, but for our graph, that's not very important. Okay, so one phase is going to look like this. Right? Do your best to make sure your graph is curvy and smooth, rather than jagged and mountainous. Okay, curvy and smooth. So that is one period, from a max to a 0, to a min to a 0, and to a max. Right? That's what a cosine does. And now we can continue with that same pattern. So we go another 0, and then a min, and then another 0, and a max. Right? We stay consistent. This repeats. So your sine and your cosine graphs repeat over and over and over those same pattern points. Okay, so those are 2 positive periods, right? 2 pi is your period. So we have 2 of those, 2 pi and then 4 pi. And then let's see what we have going to the left. Nope, we don't have an entire period. We only have half, so that's okay going to the left. Right, it would go down and then it would swoop and come back up. So this would be the graph of 4 cosine x. Okay, example 2. Cosine of pi over 2x. Okay, there's no number in front of cosine, which means we have an amplitude of 1. That's pretty standard. Here, pi over 2, this is your b value, right? The b value is a number in front of x. So we're going to calculate the period by doing 2 pi divided by pi over 2. 2 pi divided by pi over 2. Hopefully we know not to divide by a fraction, but rather to multiply by the reciprocal. So we're going to multiply by 2 over pi rather than divide by pi over 2. Okay, and pi cancel. 2 times 2 is 4. So this graph has a period of 4, which means when we label our axes, we're not going to have a pi in the label. It's just going to be normal numbers. Okay, no phase shift. There's nothing in parentheses, right? A plus or a minus in parentheses, and no vertical shift. There's nothing after right there. Okay, so we have an amplitude of 1 and a period of 4. Okay, let's see. We know it starts at a max, so we have an amplitude of 1. So cosine starts at 0, 1, right? Always on our y-axis, 1 unit above your midline. Now you have to decide, where do you want 4 to be? Okay, let's put 4, I don't know, right here. That looks like a good place for 4. So this will be 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Every one of these tick marks will be 1. There's a 6, there's 7, there's 8. Okay, our period is 4, so our x-axis is labeled with just numbers. So cosine starts at a max and it ends at a max. Okay, so the label, the vertical line we have labeled as 4, that is your period, so that's where it ends. Starts at a max, ends at a max. In the middle is a minimum, so we have a minimum at 2. And then we have zeros at 1 and 3. And then additionally at 5 and at 7 if we continue on with our pattern and our cosine. So all of these dots represent points of the cosine graph. So now we're going to do our best to make it smooth and curvy. Smooth and curvy. Not jagged and jack-o'-lantern mouth-like. Smooth and curvy. And then end up down there. So the graph looks pretty much the same. The only thing that changes is the labeling. How are we labeling your x-axis? Okay, number 3, sine of x minus 2. Okay, so here we have some, right, nothing in front of sine, amplitude of 1. Nothing in front of x, period of 2 pi. Nothing in parentheses, so no phase shift. But we do have a minus 2 after, so we have a vertical shift of down 2 units. So that's what we're going to put in first on our graph. We're going to come down 2 units from the x-axis, and we're going to put in a dashed midline. Okay, so this is the middle of your graph. It's what we're going to count above and below for in order to get our amplitude. Okay, so that's the midline. We have moved our midline, or your horizontal center, down 2 units. So how do we graph a sine? Okay, that's different than cosine. Well, sine of 0 is 0. So sine starts at the quote-unquote origin, aka the intersection of the midline and the y-axis. So it starts at the origin, right, where the midline and your y-axis cross. And since we have a period of 2 pi, let's just pick. We'll make this line 2 pi, right? You have some choice. You can put it wherever you want to, but that's a pretty convenient place. as far as the symmetry goes. So let's talk about how we graph sine. Sine starts at 0 and it ends at 0 and it has a 0 in the middle. Okay, so sine starts at 0, ends at 0, right, on your axis, on your x-axis, or in this case on your midline or the horizontal center, and it's 0 in the middle. A positive sine graph goes up to a max and then down to a min between the next zeros. So then it will go up to another max and then back to a 0, down to a min, back to a 0. Okay, and it follows this pattern for sine. 0 max, 0 min. 0 max, 0 min. And then we do our best to make our graph smooth and curvy. Okay, with a smaller amplitude, it's easier to graph a smooth and curvy sinusoid. So there's the graph of sine of x minus 2. Okay, let's do some others here. I think I'm going to skip number 4 for a minute. We'll come back to number 4 maybe later. But let's move on to number 5. Okay, dealing with a amplitude and period. Okay, the amplitude is going to be 3. The period, okay, we're going to have to calculate your period. This is 2 pi divided by 1/2. Remember, we never include the x in there. We only include the 1/2. So division of a fraction becomes multiplication by the reciprocal. So 2/1. So 2 pi times 2/1 is 4 pi. So it has a period of 4 pi. Right, no phase shift. We have nothing plus or minus in parentheses, and then no vertical shift. There's no plus or minus after your parentheses. Okay, so notice we have no markings on our grid at all, okay, which is fantastic. We get to do everything from our own brain. So sine starts at the origin, so we're going to put a starting point at the origin. And now you get to decide how far over do you want to go to put the period. Okay? You get to decide. So I'm going to say that my period is going to be this far. I have no idea how far that is. Maybe it's an inch, maybe it's 2 inches, maybe it's 3 inches, whatever. That has been my choice to put my tick mark there as my period. Okay, which means I'm going to be consistent and come that exact same distance or as best I can and put a second period on there. Okay, because I want to graph 2 periods. So however far you put your first period away, make that distance the same for your second one. Okay, so now let's graph the sine. Remember, sine starts at the 0 and it ends at 0. So we have a point here and we have a point at the period. And we also have a 0 in the middle, right? So do your best to pick out wherever the middle is for your graph, right? There's no tick marks on here, so you're just going to have to eyeball and estimate where is your middle. Okay? Now, since it's a positive sign, in the middle of your zeros is a max. So we're going to put 3 lines going up to signify that we have an amplitude of 3. And in the middle of our next zeros, we're going to put 3 lines going down to indicate that we have a minimum value of 3 also. Okay, and then we continue. Right, so in the middle here is another 0. At 8 pi will be another 0. In the middle we go up 3, 1, 2, 3. In the middle we go down 3, down 1, down 2, down 3. Okay, so these might be little Right? Might help me see that you are actually counting 3 units above your middle and 3 units below the middle. Okay, those might be good to put on there. They're not part of the graph, but they're part of you visually telling me that you understand what's going on, or visually telling your teacher if you're not one of my students. Okay, so then we graph the sine, smooth and curvy. Smooth and curvy. So without any tick marks, you get to basically be the author of your graph. Right? You get to put them wherever you want, and then make sure that you're doing things in the middle. Okay, so however far you put your line over there, pick the middle, and then the middle of that. Okay, number 6 has 2 things going on. Right, first it has an amplitude of 2. No number in front of x, so your standard period of 2 pi. And then it has a plus 3, which is your vertical shift. So up 3 without a phase shift. We'll do that tomorrow. Okay, so amplitude of 2, period of 2 pi, and up 3 units. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to come up 3 units and put in your midline. Okay, your horizontal midline. So 1, 2, 3. And then you put a horizontally dashed line as parallel as you possibly can to the x-axis. Right? Do your best to make it go parallel to your given graphed line on your piece of paper. Okay, it may or may not be parallel, but at least it's there letting me know that that is your midline. Because all of these other points, your amplitudes, your zeros, all of those stuff is based upon your midline. Okay? So if we have an amplitude of 2, that means our graph is 2 units above and below your midline. Okay, so for cosine, that first point is going to be 2 units above your midline, which is up here at 0, 5. That's where our first point goes, 2 units above your midline. And now you get to choose how far away from your origin or the y-axis do you want your period to be. So I'm going to choose that far, which means I'm going to go about that same distance again to put my second period on there. So here, right, this is my period spot. All of this is in conjunction with your midline, not necessarily with your x-axis. So my ending point is 2 units above my midline at 2 pi. Okay, so that's where my cosine first period is going to end, because it ends at a max. It starts at a max, it ends at a max. So we put the dot there. In the middle, we go 2 units down from your midline, and that's where your minimum is going to be. Okay, and then in the middle of your max and min, we're going to have a 0 on your midline. And we're going to have your 0 be on the midline. Right, so it's not on your x-axis, it's on the midline. Now we can come over here and do another period. So 4 pi, I'm going to be 2 units above. In the middle of that, I'm going to be 2 units below. And in the middle of those maxes and mins is where I put my zeros. So all of this is based upon your midline. Your zeros and your maxes and mins, your amplitude, is happening on the midline, not on your x-axis. Sometimes the x-axis is the midline, but not in this case. So we have to graph it with the midline, not with the x-axis. Okay, and then you plot your points and you make your graph curvy and smooth. Curvy and smooth. Something like that. Okay, 2 cosine x plus 3. Okay, let's do our last example here with a couple of different things. And this one has a negative in front of our 3, but the amplitude is still positive 3 because it's 3 units above and 3 units below the midline. Okay, standard period, right? There's no number in front of x, so a 2 pi period. No phase shift, there's no plus or minus in parentheses, and this one is once again down 2 units as your vertical shift. Okay, so we're going to come to our y-axis and we're going to put 2 tick marks representing going down 2 units, and you're going to put in your horizontal center. Put in your midline, making it as parallel to your x-axis as possible. This is where we're going to base our amplitude and your zeros on that line. And now we go to your amplitude. So the amplitude is 3, so I'm going to go 3 tick marks above my midline and 3 tick marks below my midline. Okay, and because it's a negative, right, because there's a negative, that means my first coordinate for cosine is going to be 3 units below my midline. If a positive cosine starts at a max, a negative cosine will start at a min. Okay, and then we come over here and we decide how far do you want your first period to be. Now I'm going to put my period mark there, 2 pi. Okay, and come over the same distance to another period of 4 pi. And now I'm going to graph using my pattern. So cosine starts and ends at the same place. So cosine starts at a minimum. That means it's going to end at a minimum. 1, 2, 3 units below your midline. Okay, 1, 2, 3 units below the midline is where we're going to end. So in the middle is where we're going to find our max. 1, 2, 3 units above your midline. 1, 2, 3 units above your midline. In other words, at positive 1, right? So it has a y value of positive 1. Positive 1 is going to be the y coordinate of all of your maxes, and negative 5 is going to, -1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Negative 5 is going to be the coordinate for all of your minimums. 3 units above and below your midline of y equals -2. So that means we're going to have, let's see, we're going to have a 0. It's going to cross your midline in the middle of your maxes and your mins. Right? So you put tick marks and put circles on your midline to help you graph your final cosine. Smooth and curvy. So when we have a midline shift, when your graph has been moved up or down, that is your horizontal center. That is where you count up and down for your amplitude, and that's also where your quote-unquote zeros go. That's where your graph crosses the midline in the middle of your maxes and your mins. Perfect. Great job. Okay, bye.